Hi, this is International Master John Watson, broadcasting for ICC. I'm going to look at the last 3 rounds of the candidates matches in Berlin, which are qualification tournament for the World Championship. And the standings right now are Fabiano Caruana and Mohamed Yarov are tied for first with 4 out of 6. And on second place, a full point behind, are Kramnik, Grishuk, and Ding Lira. Now, a lot of you have been watching this already, so you know what's going on, and you also may have seen some of these games. What I've done is I've picked what are really the best games from each round, which turn out to be the most complicated games. There hasn't been a real clear positional masterpiece of anything of that sort. The positional games have tended to be drawn and not really interesting. So even if you've seen these games, they're very exciting and very interesting. I think that they're probably 3 of the most exciting games that have been played in the candidates over the last couple of cycles. So those candidates tends to be pretty conservative, and these games are pretty wild. We've got some people playing very ambitiously. In particular, Kramnik and Caruana and Grishuk. Really, all of them, everybody's playing fairly ambitiously. And Aronian. Aronian hasn't done as well, but he's playing very ambitiously and getting very exciting games. So I'm going to show you one game from each round, maybe an excerpt from one of the games, so I don't take too long. I don't want to drag this out a lot. And like I say, you may have seen these games, but it won't hurt to see them again. They're just wonderful games. They're probably all going to go down into various anthologies, and they're going to be republished in a lot of magazines. A very exciting tournament so far. So let's start out with round 4. I've picked a game from each round. This game is between, oh, excuse me, I'm going to have to bring it up. That would help. So I get the right order. Okay, this game is between Vladimir Kramnik and Fabiano Caruana. And let's just plunge right in here. A lot of E4, E5s in top-level chess these days. Who would have dreamed it? The Sicilian era is over for the time being. Not that they don't still play the Sicilian, but it's not as incredibly popular as E4, E5. So black takes and white plays what's considered a pretty passive, harmless move. But it turns out both of these players are really fighting for a win, so it doesn't matter if, for example, if the queens go off, which is what usually happens here. Let me show you something really funny. Anand once lost a game in 6 moves, a tournament game. White played that move, which is the most common move these days, and usually black takes and this happens, and white plays with these open lines and a funny pawn structure and tries to, it's been all kinds of wonderful games there. But Anand decided he'd play here, thinking, okay, takes, he can't really pin me, I'll just unpin and I'm doing just fine. Unfortunately, this is the white's 6th move, and Anand resigned. Anand, the great world champion, lost in 6 moves. The reason for that is because this piece is attacked twice. If it's defended, you win the piece anyway with D3, and if you make the natural move, Queen E7, which I'm sure is what he intended, that move wins, because if the queen comes up, to here, for example, knight c7 wins the queen, and if the queen moves back, then simply d3 wins a whole piece, because once he takes her, he's also threatening that. So Anand resigned in 6 moves. One reason that's relevant is because in this game, white played this move, this strange move, and if black happened to play there, well, of course, you could play here immediately, or you could transpose to the Anand game with this. Okay, but that's all silly stuff. Just thought you might enjoy it. What happens in the game is this, and black takes because he's attacked 2 times on e4, and the queens go off. So you might think, oh boy, dull game, early draw, but it turns out both sides are really playing for an aggressive. This illustrates the fact that just because the queens are off doesn't mean you can't have a very interesting game. In this case, the queens and a set of minor pieces are off. So you'd think not that much could happen, but look what happens here. Okay, first of all, they've castled on opposite sides, so that's a good sign. Both sides have just basically gotten their pieces out, and white's gotten all his pieces out and now starts trying to reorganize. Black has a very solid pawn structure. It's hard to attack in this position. So Kramnik reorganizes, and you'll see what he's trying to do here. He's trying to get his bishop on the long diagonal, which is a pretty useful thing to do in chess. And black plays a very natural move, and thinking about knight takes that bishop and winning the bishop pair, which is an advantage in chess. But white pins the knight because the rook is sitting there on e8 to be taken. So you can't play knight takes f3, but after this move, protecting the rook, knight takes f3 is threatened again. So Kramnik reorganizes that, Caruana wins some time and gets some space in the center by attacking that bishop. The game's still about equal. I'm not going to go into any sort of, there really isn't much theory here to talk about. So these are basically just both players getting their pieces out. All right, so we're at a kind of a standard kind of, not standard kind of position, actually a little unusual, but kind of a normal position where both sides have gotten pieces out. Nobody seems to have any big advantage here. White plays a kind of a subtle move here, but it covers that square. There might have been a knight g4 coming, and there's one other point. If black played slowly here, let's say, I don't know, here or something, white would have a very nice little maneuver. Either the bishop has to get off this good diagonal, or if it goes onto the diagonal, white would play something like this, and guess what? There's not much to do about this. So this is I mean, not you can save your piece. You're not going to lose a piece, but that bishop's going to get stuck back there, maybe on h7 or something like that. So there is a point to h3. There's even sort of a positional threat. So Caruana, being one of the best players in the world, plays that nice move. Even though it seems to create a little bit of a weakness, it wins a tempo on the bishop, and it actually prepares to attack on the king side, because white's pieces are kind of all over on the queen side a little bit. And here's the idea. First he gets his king into safety. White stops this move d5, and maybe he's even thinking about c5 at some point. And there, that nice little move breaking through. Maybe black's already a little better because he's threatening to win a pawn. And if white takes, which he doesn't, let me see what I was going to say about that. Yeah, if white would take here, I think we'd have some problems with this move because that's attacked and that's attacked. So even if this falls, that rook's stuck. Oh yeah, so this is quite strong actually. Okay, so you can see that that's quite good. So instead Kramnik plays what I'm sure he had prepared before, that move, trying to win the bishop pair and maybe play knight takes d6. Black naturally doesn't wants to get rid of that powerful knight, and checks, and then takes this pawn. It all looks very innocent, but in fact now, if white takes here, suddenly black gets the better game. Very surprisingly, because that's a bit of a weak pawn, and white has the two bishops. But there's tactics here, and there's also the fact that that bishop's pretty bad right now, and that bishop's not necessarily that great. But the main point is this rook's attacked, and it really has nowhere to go because it gets forked on that square. So it would have to go, and would get forked on e1, so it has to go to some square like this. Then black would play here. I'll just do this real quickly. You can check it out yourself later. Now the bishop's attacked, and so white would probably take this. Is that right? Oh yeah, but then we have this check. So it's just a question of concrete things. White has the two bishops. White's about to play c5 with an overwhelming game, but the tactics are working for black. Because after that move, he has this nice move. Very cute how the knights maneuver. And now knight takes there is a strong idea because for one thing, the back rank is kind of weak. And for another thing, this pawn is going to be a passed pawn. And right now he's threatening knight takes bishop, rook takes, and let me just show you that. If white made some completely non-move, he can't take the rook, the knight back because of mate on the last rank. So tactically, all of a sudden, it's a disaster because after black takes this with tempo, he's also going to win this pawn and have a couple passed pawns on the queen side. And I could show you more details, but that's basically what's going on there. So that all that means is that white really doesn't want to take this pawn back. So what Kramnik had planned is something more dynamic. The idea is to weaken that square, maybe take it, or if black takes it, the same thing happens, and then this knight is hanging. There's also possibilities maybe of f4 at some point. But Caruana's ready for this. He attacks the rook. The rook doesn't want to go back for the reasons we already talked about, so it goes over to take that with check. And it looks like he's getting some counterplay, but this is a very strong pawn. There's chances of that pawn queening, and he takes that with check, and black simply goes straight back. So we have here, let me see, black's a pawn ahead. But white's threatening this, and he has pressure in the center, and he's got the 7th rank. The problem is this pawn is so strong. So at this point, black plays here. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. It's white's move. He takes the pawn. He wants to get his pawn back and get a strong passed pawn on the center files. So positionally, it looks like white's got some ideas, but that move is very strong. Notice the bishop has no real squares. If the bishop moves this way, there's a whole new queen coming. So knight takes bishop is a big threat. Fortunately, white has a counterattack going on here. He can give up that piece, and does, and then take this. And that's an interesting move because it attacks that very powerful pawn. It stops knight to f3 followed by queening the pawn, which was another huge threat. And it supports the d pawn advancing, and it has an idea of taking that rook. So it's a very, very multiple purpose move. On the other hand, white is temporarily at least a piece down. So let's see what happens here. Black saves, black attacks that pawn, and in fact it's a direct attack because if white made, let's say, a slow move like took this or something, rook takes is a threat because rook takes wins a pawn, and it also threatens rook takes checkmate. But if white plays rook takes, then there's checkmate down here. Okay, so that's basically what's going on there, and let's go back. But of course white doesn't give him that pawn, white advances, and of course that's a very powerful passed pawn, just as powerful as this one, which by the way white would like to eliminate soon. It's too strong, too dangerous a pawn. So black has to move his rook, and he goes to the 7th rank himself. So now he's got a 7th rank rook, and you'll see that's very important to be aggressive. There's one idea of taking this pawn and getting connected passed pawns. He'd actually have 3 connected passed pawns. 2 of them would be moving pretty fast. So rook takes f2 is certainly an idea. On the other hand, the rook's not defending the last rank anymore, so whites can maybe get some tactics going. First he eliminates that very dangerous pawn, and now he moves his bishop back. Now all white has to do is somehow get a rook to a square like this, and maybe another rook to a square like that, and break down that blockade of the d8 square. On the other hand, black has a nice passed pawn, another passed pawn, and you'll see pretty active pieces. And he plays that move. Now that turns out oddly enough to be a mistake. It's a good move, and it's enough to keep an advantage. But it just happens to turn out. Now you have to remember, this has been very complicated, all these last moves, so they're getting in severe time trouble. And it's only move 31, but it just turns out that this was actually a better way to do it because it reserves that idea of knight check there, as well as having the idea of knight e3, which was what the point of knight g4 was. So a small point, but it turns out to be fairly important because white starts to get a little bit of counterplay going. White takes that. Now white has 4 passed pawns. All these 3 plus that one, and they're all connected. So that would be normally you'd think, well, that's way more than enough for a piece. But black does have these 2 passed pawns himself. Also, the opposite colored bishops may favor black a little bit if he starts attacking, because this bishop can be so strong down here, and it can't be blocked by this bishop, which is kind of blocked by its own pawn at this point. Still, it's a very, very close game at this point. So black attacks the rook and attacks this pawn. White attacks the bishop, and now black misses a little opportunity. He plays there. Anybody would do that in time trouble. Just play it safe. Don't goof around. And you know, Caruana's a 2800 player, so he's going to make a quick move here in time trouble. But he could have played, as it turns out, he could have played this nice little move. The first point's kind of obvious. I'm sure he thought about it. If I can get rid of that bishop, I'm doing great. I have rook g6, so this pawn's weaker now. But the problem is, I'm sure that he thought in terms of something like bishop here and kind of maybe freaked out a little bit about what was going on, but it turns out he can play rook f2 here, because after rook here, there's a check and a checkmate after bishop d1 and captures. Now, obviously Caruana probably saw that exact line, but he saw there were too many things to look at. With almost no time left, you can't risk there being some kind of blunder here. So he played a simpler move, just defended the bishop. You can see how wonderful and considering the opening, how amazingly interesting this game has turned out to be. White's thinking about rook c8, and he's also clearing a path through the a pawn. That's a great move. Kramnik has great instincts. So does Caruana. He's going to centralize his king. That's what you do in positions like this. And suddenly it's a pawn race. Now it just happens to turn out, and this is a very nice move too, rook up. He's thinking about rook here to challenge that rook and start moving his own pawn, but he's also thinking about rook b4, attacking this pawn and attacking the bishop. Very nice little geometrical move. White stops rook b4, and black comes up to attack the rook. And now, as I say, he tries to get his pawn moving by challenging that rook. The rook comes back here, and now it just happens to turn out, I think that white had maybe a better move in one of these positions. But there's several mistakes here, but that's not really important. I'll just give you the flow of the game. They're not big mistakes at all. They're very, very tight, close things. Actually, let me go back 1 second, though. This is worth seeing. We have enough time for this, because one of the games we're not going to look at it as a whole. This move actually was a big opportunity for Kramnik to play a great move, but it's almost the last move before time control. That's a great move. The point is, after taking, you're not going to go over and try to win this, which is risky, but you're going to win it this way. Check, discover check, followed by simply rook takes, and that will win for white. So he has to not take, he has to play a move like, for example, I don't know, king, I don't know, maybe something like king e7, but it turns out this is just extremely good for white. Maybe he pins that. Excuse me, I can't quite remember how this goes exactly, how white wins this. Oh, I think he plays very cleverly here. He just pushes his pawn. And if rook takes, which seems to stop the pawn from pushing, then look at this. That attacks the rook. It's thinking about pushing the pawn through, and if the rook moves over, there's this nice check, just winning this knight. Well, how can you see this with no time left, right? But still, that was a good way to play it, rook c6 check. Instead, he plays much more naturally, and we saw that move. Now he starts pushing his pawn. He's trying to just push the pawn right down to f2 and queen it or win some material. And after a6, it turns out, for tactical reasons, he has to play h5 first. That's another pass pawn that's going to be very dangerous. Black has to stop the pawn from queening. Now there's no rook b8 because he can take that pawn. Oh, is that true? Yes, because the bishop's still on this pawn. White doesn't want to give up both of his pass pawns, even if he wins a piece. So he should have played c4, just for tactical reasons. I'll show you what that means. Here. He could play check immediately. And the idea here is that after that, the other rook gets into play too. And I won't go into this. You can look at the game afterwards, but it turns out that simply wins. So he would have to actually move the king somewhere else, and that would mean that white had gained a tempo for pushing that pawn. You'll see in the game he pushes that pawn anyway, but he's lost one move, and one move is so important in these positions. Okay, there's that h4 move, and now he plays c4. So he's going to get c5 check in, but he wasted a tempo trying to get it. And in fact, I'm not sure. I think white might still have the better game. Look at those pawns, but it's getting close. Now he should probably just go ahead and queen that and play this check here. And but it's not easy. And then put the bishop here and try to queen his pawn. But it's not easy because of black's pawns. I won't go into that. But so c5 check, which is completely natural. C4 and c5 check may not be the best way to go. So he plays that move. Now what he should do is play this move. But again, imagine playing with this kind of time left. And also remember, the World Championship is potentially at stake here. So both sides are playing under incredible pressure. And finding all these exact moves is just almost impossible. That was the way to play it and still have good winning chances. So instead he plays here, gives back the very, very important pawn, and attacks the bishop, hoping to take it and win and queen his own pawn. But black plays very nicely. He actually has ideas along this diagonal, and that's probably what Kramnik didn't realize how strong that was. So Kramnik goes ahead and queens. The problem is otherwise there's going to be issues with rook. There's a rook mate possibility down here. So black takes that, and white takes. And the reason white, let me see. Does white have anything left here to play? He could try to play here. Let me see about that for a second. I guess I may be missing something obvious, but I think this move is awfully strong, just to hit the bishop and then play rook takes check. Anyway, he played instead of that. He took this one, and black went back to the long diagonal. And white played attacking the bishop, but that allowed black that move I talked about. And now black's starting to get a big attack, but it's still very unclear because white has an exchange ahead, and that's a nice little move. White attacks that and wants to get his pawn going. Notice the king's a little shaky here, though. And so you can see that black's trying to attack here and plays another nice clever move, thinking about rook a1 check, thinking about knight takes c1. White moves over with check, and now he attacks the knight, check, and he should come. It turns out he should come back to c1, even though that allows this check, because he goes to this square, and that turns out to be, I believe, a pretty important mistake. Yeah, very nice move now, because he could repeat, just play knight b3 or something like that. Instead, he plays this very nice move here. Very cute, attacking this rook and thinking again about rook a1 check. So white plays naturally, but that falls right into this very nice little combination. Takes. Amazing. So that was hard to see, but actually just wins. Because he actually ends up moving the bishop, but the problem is if he plays something like there, then it turns out there's no way to stop this anymore. Beautifully calculated, beautifully looked at, but Kramnik's also finding nice moves all throughout this game, so it's just a very good thing. The idea is you can't stop that pawn anymore because the bishop blocks off the rook. Isn't that cute? So there's only a couple more moves. That wins the game because now black's won big material. And still has the idea of queening his pawn. So he makes this very simple. Just takes the remaining pawn. I think, does white resign now? Now this rook's attacked, and knight c4 is coming. Both pawns are threatening to queen, and he resigns. So what a fantastic game, right? This is just an absolutely amazing game, and obviously very important for the standings. Kramnik was in first place, I think, before this game. That's right, he was. And then Caruana moved into first place. Okay, let's quickly move to another game here. We don't want to use up your entire afternoon, but you can see what beautiful game that is. And so is the following is very interesting also. Let me put that in there. Let me find the next game for you guys. Some great double-edged fights in this tournament. And of course, everybody's trying for first place. As they say, second place doesn't matter. They've got all year to raise their rating or to win second place in any tournament. They don't have all year to qualify for the World Championship. So, okay, so we're moving into sort of a same-ish kind of King's Indian Benoni. This can come from the King's Indian or the Benoni, the position that you'll see in a second. I'm not going to give you any opening theory, but one thing to mention here, though, is that in particular this system that you'll see here that white's playing, both Aronian and Grischuk have a lot of experience in this, and I'm sure they both prepared this line in depth. It's funny, it's very risky for black, but Grischuk played very aggressive, creative chess, and Aronian's playing pretty aggressively too. So now the idea is to chase that knight away and gain some more space. And of course, all this is played a million times. That's an interesting move. Some people go ahead and they castle and they play for h4, and then they attack in the center. I guess I won't go into that, but this is a less normal. It's a normal move. It's been played before quite a bit, but it's not as popular as playing castles in h4 next, and then playing for the move f5. Okay, so white plays that. Now that's a new move. I don't think it's even been played in correspondence. The normal move is to play here, and then if h4, you can just swing the knight around back to the center. And the other way to play it is you can castle, but this is by far the most normal move. So white plays there. Black protects the d pawn and puts his queen on a nice open line. And white moves up, and pretty soon here black gets kind of in a funny position. He gets in some trouble. Makes that move. That's an interesting move. It might be one of the better moves. I'm not sure. But the reason he plays it is because he wants to drive him off this dangerous diagonal. Notice the bishop can't go back that way. And after he retreats, this is kind of what's called a pseudo outpost because it's hard to drive it away. If you tried to drive it away right now, you wouldn't gain anything from this. All you'd have is a backward pawn on an open file with a real outpost in front of it. But by pseudo outpost, I mean that the knight can theoretically still be driven back. And in fact, look what happens. Aronian plays that move, and the idea is to play f4, and then that's not an outpost at all, is it? So that's the next move, f4, and Grischuk has to plan for that. Now, there's some weaknesses in this position for black, so black has to play dynamically. And he's going to try to, as quickly as possible, either get the move b5 in, maybe even castle, maybe get the move f5 in. But first he has to get his pieces out. Now, the point is that if white goes here now, black's got a nice square there that threatens white's best bishop. And if white has to take that, then white is very weak on the light squares, and black's doing fine, better than fine. He's also stopped white from castling queenside. So white's not going to make that move. And white plays, let me see if I have any notes here. White takes, and now the engine points out that that's a pretty good move. And it's almost a little surprising Grischuk didn't play that. He knows these positions really well, but I think he was confident with that move, so he wasn't too worried. The idea is that after f4, which is really the only reasonable move, then this check, even though white's a pawn ahead, he's kind of all messed up. The center's kind of messed up, and black has two bishops. And black can play, for example, this move. Then white probably shouldn't try to hold on to his extra pawn. He should play that way, and then this way. sort of like the game. And I think white is better here, but it's not as clear as the game, and you'll see what I mean by that. So in the game he plays there, he allows this move f4, but if he plays f4 immediately, we get that position we talked about where the knight's so well placed there. So he plays rook g1 first, and the idea is to cover the g4. First of all, it's with tempo on the bishop, and secondly, it covers the g4 square, so f4 is going to be a major move. Okay, so black counterattacks and protects the bishop, and now the idea is that if f4, black still has a square over here. That's sort of one of the ideas here. So he plays f4 anyway. There's not much else to do for white. His center is being attacked a little bit. Black's about to get consolidated by castling, and white's pieces are not all that active yet. So really he wants to move quickly, and that means getting rid of that knight. The knight goes to a good square, and you might wonder, what on earth is white doing? He's letting his center be broken up, but then he has this very nice move. It's a thematic classical break, very beautiful though, and you have to have some guts to actually play these moves for white because your center's falling apart. The idea is that after black takes, which he has to because of the threat of e6, you have that beautiful passed pawn. And the other idea is that you've got this move threatening to win the queen, so the passed pawn is actually supporting a very important piece. And you can imagine that this kind of position is really undesirable because the king is stuck in the center of the board. And in fact, that's pretty much losing, as it turns out. So what black does is he does what a lot of professionals do these days. He wants to give up the exchange. He doesn't mind giving up a rook for a knight as long as these pawns don't kill him. He's got a few extra pawns himself, potentially very active bishop. So in fact, white does take that exchange. There isn't that much else to do. It's also a very strong move. And here, now this is an interesting position because Grischuk had 2 minutes left. This is one of his old problems. Now he hasn't been doing it that much recently, but in this game he was so close to losing on those early moves or getting a terrible game that he burned up all of his time. I'm not sure if the clock was exactly right when I was watching it, but it's somewhere between 4 and 2 minutes at this point. And Ronian had 55. So he's got all the time in the world to work all this out. But amazingly, he starts to make mistakes. First he plays this move, which looks good or strong. You know, it puts more pressure down the file, and you'll see why it's well, the threats that it creates. But it turns out if he'd simply castled, and now it looks terrible, but if he had just calculated this line, which is not impossible to calculate, he would have really won the game. And you might say, wow, this is crazy. How can he do that? Well, one point is that he was taking that as problem because of the file, and pinning it, which looks absolutely amazing. You know, he's going to win a whole queen with this kind of move. Actually turns out badly because of this amazing move, bishop here. Now, these are moves that you and I might not be able to find, but with 50 minutes, I would think Aronian, you know, one of the great players of our time, could have found. The point is, this is winning a whole queen followed by queening itself. So there's no time for bishop takes e3. And if he takes it, then the easiest win, I think, is just to go here, king up, and then take it, threatening this knight and threatening to queen, even though black gets a check or two in, white's just winning too much material. So that's what he should have done, and instead he plays something similar but not at all as good, which was this move. And the reason that it's not as good is because of Grischuk's really beautiful reply. It's the only move, but it's a great reply, especially when you've probably got 10 seconds left or something to do it. They get an increment. They get 30 seconds after every move, so maybe he was down to playing on the very last seconds of his increment. That very nice move. And now white has to kind of figure out what to do. It's all kind of confusing how to continue here. The first major point is that if bishop here, an awfully natural move, which seems to win immediately, there is a little bit of a problem. That's called checkmate. So that's the first point, is that the bishop can't move either way. Bishop can't go that way. Bishop can't go because of this checkmate in 1. And so white plays the move that he was intending to play anyway, this queening of the pawn. And there's just no other way to really play this position, I don't think. And then he plays that move, and this was his idea. The problem is that after this move, his next move, black could have simply gone back, and oddly enough, black actually stands a little bit better here. You can check that out yourself. It's been analyzed a lot, of course. These games are very important, and they're looked at a lot. But black has no time at all left, plays this move, which turns out to should be like a complete blunder, because Aronian cleverly plays that move. That's the right move. It's a terrific move. And really the queen has no good place to go, so he offers the exchange, but he can't really protect the bishop anymore. So no, white could just play queen takes here and here. Aronian has all the time in the world to work that out. But there is a little problem. He probably thought this was a dangerous move. But as I say, he's such a brilliant calculator and attacker that he should have seen that now he's just winning, completely winning. There's no square for the king. King has to go back, check. The bishop has to go back, check, and mate's going to follow really soon, plus massive material advantage. Should have seen that. This is a tragic game for Aronian. He was probably just very nervous, and he has played poorly in critical positions in the candidates before, so this is a very tragic miss. It's a very easy win, queen takes, but, well, I shouldn't say very easy, because, you know, nothing's easy under this kind of pressure, and, you know, you do have to see this kind of clever rook takes g4 move. Still, he should have seen this. Instead, he played that check and took a pawn and just went for this endgame. And he pins the knight now. But we end up in this sort of late middle game endgame. And really it's an endgame, I guess. And it turns out black's actually slightly better in this position. Now, I think for the sake of the show, and for the sake of not boring you to death, I may stop here. The game was finally drawn. It probably is a draw. But black is actually slightly better right now. And I won't show you. There's quite a few moves to go. And I'd rather get on to the next game and show you the next position. You can just assume that this game was drawn. In fact, it's what is the material right now? Because white has the two bishops, he was able to win a pawn back. I'll show you a few more moves. He was able to get a pawn back pretty quickly. And when you have two bishops and you've won your pawn back, then you're probably going to be okay a pawn down. In fact, black took a draw at this point because the king's a little exposed too. And you can look at this game and decide later for yourself what you think was going on there. Okay, so one last game, sixth round now we go to, and this is the game between Wesley So and Lev Aronian again. And Aronian is now in desperate trouble after this game because of losing another game. On the other hand, he's such a good player, and it's a long tournament. There's 14 rounds, so you can't count him out yet. But I think what happened was the last game depressed him, the fact that he had so many easy wins the last game, and he didn't play quite as well this game. But maybe more importantly, Wesley So, who was in last place going into this game, played a beautiful, beautiful game, and is now sort of back in the hunt too a little bit. He's not had a good tournament, but everybody still has a little bit of a chance here. But Aronian and So are now in more trouble than they should have been. Okay, so it's a Roy Lopez. I'm not going to show you any theory here. It's really not worth it. Maybe real quick to mention is Aronian is the leading expert in the world in the so-called martial attack, which is this move. And so because of that, So avoids that with the anti-martial, which Kasparov won many games with as white. And he plays this move that stops the move a5. I'm just not going to show you. These are all normal moves. And the game's probably about equal. It's probably about equal for quite a while now, actually. Aronian plays a nice little plan now. He's a very creative player. This is interesting. He clamps down in the center, and one idea is to sort of isolate that pawn. You'll see that with the following move. Rook there, putting in another piece on it, 2, and he can even make that 3 this way, or maybe 4 or something, with the queen. But white's allowed to break through in the meantime, so it's a good, balanced, interesting, dynamic game. Both sides are being very ambitious here. Aronian decides to simply win a pawn, because after all, white's just won the center and has a nice central ideas. And I'm not going to really analyze this much. And white takes, and the reason white takes is that that's an isolated pawn. He also has pressure on this open file, and he might have pressure on another open file. So white has compensation for the pawn here. Now, whether he has more than enough compensation, I don't actually know. But I think most players would rather be white here, because you notice if the knight ever moves, that pawn can be loose too. There's a lot of pressure down that file too. And if the knight moves, there's a beautiful square for this knight on c4. That's the classic outpost. So forget the pawn, actually. You'd probably play knight c4, which is really, really a strong move. Okay, so black reorganizes his pieces. White stops that pawn from advancing and that pawn from advancing in order to secure that outpost on an open file. Let me see. Okay, it's very soon now. Black retreats to hold that c pawn, and he comes back to hold his knight. It looks a little passive for black, but it's not that. It's not that as passive as it looks. And he is a pawn ahead, and he's hoping to be able to simplify later. And he simplifies now by taking that. Now this pawn's hanging, but black has that move attacking the rook. And then he comes back to defend his pawns in the center. But you see these pieces are all a little bit awkward. And the question is, how can white take advantage of this? So, I mean, he's got a decent game anyway. Being a pawn down isn't too bad when you've got, your opponent has a bunch of weaknesses. But it's not that great either, because you are a pawn down after all. And he finds this very nice idea, which is, you'll see this in a second, right now, the move e5. Very, very nice move. The first point is very simple. If bishop takes, knight here, and there's no stopping both queen takes, mate, and knight takes with a big old fork, and followed by coming down with the rooks. So even after you won material, you'd win more. So he can't take it, but then there's more points to this, which is that after he comes back, defending this, which doesn't look that bad, he has this very nice move, knight d4. And you might think, okay, that wasn't that hard, because now this rook is pretty much trapped, and knight takes e6 is also threatened. But here's the real point. After black moves that rook, he takes that pawn, and you might think, well, why doesn't he just take material? Well, for one thing, black already has one pawn, and these pawns are very dangerous. So white would be an exchange up. He might even have the better game, but it's a scary position with those pawns advancing. And also knight d5 follows naturally. Now that's an outpost because there's no pawn that can attack that knight. So a lot of people would have been tempted to take that to get material, but instead So simply recovers his pawn, and then begins a sort of funny little attack. All of a sudden these pieces aren't that good, and white's aiming at the king side a little bit. You'll see that. And he controls the d-file. So white's quite a lot better here. He had a beautiful move here that the computers show, but I don't know who else in the world would have played a move like this. That's a very nice move. It's a very silly move. Actually, it's not much better than knight f4, but it does cement the knight on that square. And the idea is that if black takes, white goes here, threatening checkmate again, and threatening what else? Guess what? Big fork on the king. So black couldn't actually take that rook. That's a computer move if we've ever seen one. This is a very nice move too, simply centralizing. And black attacks that knight. Probably not the best move, but now the idea is just simply move this bishop, and then you're on that. There's no real good retreat square for black. So black tries to exchange queens. White retreats. It turns out that queen a2 was even better because it attacked that pawn there, and the rook would have been hard to defend. But these are technical points. And once again, we've got a time issue. Look how well they're playing with time. So black retreats. I don't know what the other moves were. Oh, okay. So he plays the next move, and white plays that plan we're talking about. He's thinking about rook e6 or knight e6 or whatever. Black, with probably not a great deal of time left, we're on move 36, plays this move c4, tries to mix things up, but it turns out very, very poorly, because there's no squares for the queen now. There's no decent squares for the queen, as it turns out. See, this is covered by this queen, and then that'll fall, and the back rank is falling. And if this move, there's this problem, rook here, and there's no way to defend, no good way to defend this position. I don't know if I give any variations there, but this is overwhelming. So Aronian decides to give up the queen by playing that move, and that gives it the queen because of check, attacking this way. Aronian wanted to get as much material as possible and hoped to draw this game, but it turned out that this was actually quite an easy win. And the reason it was quite an easy win, and maybe he missed this last move, but after queen e4, that's a double attack on these two squares. So white's just winning too much material. Even though black has passed pawns that are sort of dangerous, it's just not enough. It's really not even really close to enough. He keeps playing. I won't go on to show this whole thing. I think I'll close up this show, but basically black can't quite queen that pawn. He's got some pressure, and white slowly but surely makes some progress on the king side. Eventually he simplifies. Maybe I'll show a few more moves since it's our last game. And okay, so he gives up that extra material, but with the point of, okay, now he's attacking that, and he's also got mating ideas just coming with this. He's got a queen versus rook and bishop, which is an advantage. And he also has an extra pawn, and he's about to push his own pawns forward. I could show you how that went. It went on for a long time, but let me just show you, maybe up to the point where he wins the a pawn, because you can imagine once he wins the a pawn, it's all over. And that was right now. And so this is just overwhelming for white. Very nice game by So. Easily his best game of the tournament, but he'd had a little bit of bad luck before this also, and he's obviously one of the strongest players in the world also, so it's nice to see him catching up. Okay, everybody, that's what's going on. Let me just tell you that now we have, let me see, did I mention, I don't know if I mentioned the standings, but I should mention them one more time so you can start watching again tomorrow. It's very exciting. Caruana and Mamedyarov have 4 points and are 1 full point ahead of Kramnik, Grishuk, and Ding Liren, who have 3. And you can check the rest of it all out on ICC or other websites. You can watch the World Championship live on various websites. You can watch it on ICC. They're transmitting the moves as they come in. All right, thanks everybody, and hopefully you enjoyed that, and you'll have a good time watching the rest of the candidates. Thanks, and good night.